I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Exodus 20:2.
3,500 years ago, the Bible tells us, one of the greatest events in history took place on a mountaintop in the most desolate region on earth.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
One man, Moses, is said to have come face to face with an all-powerful, supreme being.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image.
But the historical evidence of this incident seems to have been blown away by the sands of time.
People in the desert leave very few traces for archaeologists to follow.
Any large group of hundreds of thousands, if that number is even possible in the Sinai, would have left garbage, broken pottery, and so forth.
What was the real root of the Exodus? Something that perhaps we're never going to know.
Who was Moses? What happened on Mount Sinai? These are but a few of the mysteries of the Bible. The evocative stories told within the Bible are eternal. Silent yet eloquent evidence of biblical times lies scattered across the timeless landscape of the Sinai. Much has been resurrected through patient digging into the past, through the discovery of ancient objects that frequently prove the Bible's authenticity. But some secrets may never be uncovered, frustrating the scholar, the archaeologist, and the historian. Scant evidence remains of one of the greatest of all biblical stories, the enslavement of the Hebrews in Egypt, their redemption by Moses, and the receiving of the Ten Commandments.
There has always been the hope that archaeology can provide information that the texts do not contain, that there'll be some sort of independent witness to the so-called events of the Bible which will verify them or which will provide the kind of historical information that the Bible doesn't provide. Because of that, there have been for a very long time explorations and excavations throughout the Sinai Peninsula looking for traces of the Exodus.
Most scholars do agree on one thing. The Exodus took place during Egypt's 18th dynasty, fully 13 centuries before Christ, when the pharaoh Ramesses II was on the throne.
Ramses was the last of the great pharaohs of the Egyptian New Kingdom and was involved in a great many monumental building projects for which we know the Egyptians imported many slaves, and to find slaves from Palestine or Canaan among them would not in itself be surprising.
Not content with the enslavement of the Hebrews and fearful of their increasing numbers, Pharaoh issues an edict condemning all their newly born male children to death. It was then, the Bible tells us, that a Hebrew child was born to lowly slave parents. To spare him from Pharaoh's decree, the baby is set adrift in a basket on the river Nile. The basket drifts downstream, carrying the infant Moses to his destiny and into immortality. Pharaoh's daughter finds the child and takes him in as her own. He would become one of the giants of history, and perhaps the most enduring of all biblical figures. He would help introduce humanity to a revolutionary new idea, the concept of monotheism, a belief in one supreme God. He would found a nation and become central to the three great religions of the Western world. Even though his story dominates the pages of the Old Testament, We have no physical proof, no archaeological evidence whatever, that he even existed.
If one doubts the existence of Moses as a historical figure, then you do have a problem. How do you explain, then, the origins of Israelite religion if it was not founded by a single individual, as most great religions have been? In short, if Moses hadn't existed, perhaps we would have to invent him.
I no more doubt the existence of Moses than I do the existence of Muhammad or the existence of Jesus. We know that there is a considerable amount of questionable tradition that's been associated with all of these figures. But to doubt, therefore, that the figure existed, I think is an unnecessary cynicism.
Was Moses aware of his humble origins? Did he ever identify with the Hebrew slaves toiling under the lash to build the great cities of Pithom and Ramses?
The remarkable part of Moses' early years is that the Bible is completely silent about it. Moses says nothing, as far as we know, nothing, and we know nothing of what was taught to him. And when he walks out of the palace for the first time that we read in the text, what would you expect him to see? I mean, when you think of Egypt, what do you think of? Pyramids and sphinxes, great, vast, impressive civilization. But it says Moses walked out of the palace and saw the sufferings of his fellow Jews. And that means that Moses was stirred, whatever his early education was about, was stirred not by the visual splendor of Egypt, but by the oppressiveness of that society and the sufferings of other human beings.
And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Exodus 2:11.
So Moses becomes a runaway, a fugitive from his life of luxury and privilege. He heads toward an unforeseen destiny, that of champion of the Hebrew slaves, chosen to lead his people to freedom and nationhood. But until that time was to come, he would settle in the land of Midian, a tribal territory to the east of the Sinai desert. Most scholars believe that Moses was 20 years old when he escaped from Egypt and went to the land of Midian. For the next 6 decades, he lives his simple life on the fringe of the Sinai. One day, he follows a stray lamb through a particularly rocky outcrop and comes face to face with the divine. At a place which the Bible refers to as the mountain of God, a voice miraculously speaks to him from within a bush, aflame but not consumed by the fire.
God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Exodus 3:4.
Scholars have long puzzled over the mystery of the burning bush, during which God speaks directly to Moses. He tells him that he has chosen him to lead his people from slavery to redemption, to a promised land flowing with milk and honey.
You can try to explain the story of Moses encountering the burning bush in naturalistic fashion, as if it's a dry area. The bush had turned bright colors because of the season of the year, or it was so dry it had sort of had self-combustion. I mean, all that's possible. But I think unlikely. It's a sign of the presence of God, what scholars call a theophany. And it shows Moses being accosted by God and given a commission.
So God commands Moses to undertake a daunting and seemingly impossible task, the freeing of his people from Egyptian bondage. But Moses is unsure of his suitability for the mission. He has suffered from a speech impediment since childhood. He now uses this as an excuse.
O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech, and of a slow tongue. Exodus 4:10.
When he was very young, the Pharaoh worried about this child and whether he would grow up to be a usurper of his throne. And so he put Moses in between, equidistant between a crown on one side and a hot coal on the other, to see if he would crawl one way or the other. And if he crawled towards the crown, Pharaoh would destroy him. Like any child, Moses was drawn to the sparkles in the crown, and he began to crawl that way when the rabbis say an angel pushed him in the other direction, and he touched the coal, which burned his hand. He immediately transferred his hand to his mouth to cool it off, and burned his tongue, which is why later on in the Bible, Moses is spoken of as having a speech impediment. So God says, let my people go that they may serve me. And Moses says, essentially, pick somebody else. I don't talk right, he says. I have a speech impediment. Pharaoh won't listen to me. He comes up with every excuse he can think of. To which God says, not in so many words, Moses, this is not an optional assignment. You have to do this. You don't have a choice.
Here we have Moses, a simple shepherd who wasn't even paying much attention to God at the time, is called to be the deliverer of God's people. And he can't even speak well. He's not a mighty orator. He's not a general. He's not a powerful ruler. He's not an emperor. The scriptures say again and again and again that it is not through the powerful that God acts. It is precisely through the weak that God acts. It is precisely through the unexpected, through the small, through the ill-prepared, that God's power can be magnified and shown.
Bearing God's message and accompanied by his brother Aaron as his spokesman, Moses returns to Egypt to confront Pharaoh. And so begins an epic chronicle of a people. When we return, a search for clues to the conflict between a mighty Egyptian ruler and the humble shepherd Moses, with his calling to let my people go. Mysteries of the Bible will be right back.
We now return to Mysteries of the Bible.
"40 years after fleeing from Egypt, Moses has crossed the desert on his mission from God to redeem his people. Accompanied by his brother Aaron, he confronts Pharaoh and urges him to let the Hebrew slaves go. To convince him that they have been sent by a God mightier than the gods of Egypt, they display a supernatural feat.
And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did as the Lord had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent." Exodus 7:10.
Not to be outdone, the Egyptian priests counteract with a trick of their own. They too turn their staffs into serpents. But in a strikingly symbolic act, they are quickly swallowed by the serpent of Moses.
The Bible wants to make it out that the God of Israel and his prophets are more powerful than any of the magic of Egypt, and wants to make the point that Egypt is a country steeped in magic, but that magic is false religion, and the only real religion is monotheism. So what it does is it takes the very staff, which in a certain way is the symbol of Egyptian magic, the staff which is really the magic wand, places it in Moses' hand and uses it as a symbol of God's overcoming the Egyptian religion and the power that it supposedly had, and showing that ultimately it was all fraud.
Fraudulent and exploitative though it may have been, Pharaoh's power over the people is nevertheless real. He refuses to set the slaves free. And so another mystery of the Bible is introduced into the story. The wrath of God that brings down the first of the 10 plagues.
"Thus saith the Lord, in this shalt thou know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the rod that is in mine hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians shall loathe to drink of the water of the river." Exodus 7:17.
And a number of scholars have suggested the plagues are a result of some natural phenomena. For example, a flooding of the Nile, an east wind called the Khamsin, and so forth, that could lead to disease and a discoloration of the Nile and so forth. But of course, the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. That's very difficult to explain in any kind of naturalistic way.
Pharaoh does not heed the warning. Time and again he refuses to free the slaves, and time and again God rains terror and plague upon him and his people. Water turned into blood, followed by frogs, lice, flies, cattle disease, boils, hailstones and fire, locusts, then darkness. Always agreeing to set the Hebrews free, then always renouncing his promise, Pharaoh's heart remains hardened. It is only in the 10th and final plague, when all the firstborn of the Egyptians are struck down in death, that Pharaoh relents. Miraculously, the Israelites are spared this terrible tragedy by obeying God's commandment to paint the doorposts of their houses with the blood of a sacrificial lamb.
And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you, to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. Exodus 12:13.
Tens of thousands of Egyptian firstborn perished that night, including Pharaoh's own son. So finally Pharaoh agrees to let the Hebrews go. Some scholars believe he had not been fully convinced of God's power until then, because each of the previous 9 disasters had occurred naturally at some time during Egypt's long history. Could there have been a rational explanation for the plagues?
It is not the business of archaeology to prove that miracles could have taken place or did take place. We always have to remember the theology behind the stories. The writers are trying to make a point. God is the God over nature, and therefore miracles can happen. We moderns may or may not believe that, but it's clear that the ancients did believe it.
For Jews throughout the world, the miracle of the plagues, the sparing of the Hebrew firstborn, redemption from slavery, and eventual deliverance to the Promised Land has been celebrated at the Passover meal every year for the past 33 centuries. Unleavened bread is eaten for 7 days, symbolizing the frugal and hurried meal the people prepared before their departure from Egypt.
And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot. About 600,000 on foot that were men, beside children, and a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, and very much cattle. Exodus 12:37.
The Bible tells us that 600,000 male adult slaves, plus their families, and a throng of non-Hebrew slaves left Egypt. But that number has long been debated by historians.
The Hebrew word for 1,000 is the word eleph, and it is also used in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible on occasion for a tent group or clan. And so some folks have surmised that the word 600,000 elephim would be actually 600 tent groups or clans, or like companies of soldiers, since the reference is to adult males. And that would mean then that we're dealing with a much lower number of people.
However many there were, progress would have been slow, perhaps no more than 5 or 6 miles a day. Within a week, the caravan reaches a forbidding frontier, a seemingly impassable body of water. It would be the site of yet another miracle.
And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Exodus 14:21.
But where did the miraculous parting of the waters happen? Today, scholars doubt whether it took place in any of the seas around Egypt.
One thing is clear, it's not the Red Sea, that gigantic deep sea that they somehow would have walked across. It's the Reed Sea, according to the Hebrew Bible, and the Reed Sea is apparently some type of lake or swamp or whatever else. But again, this is one of these stories. The Bible is telling us that there is a miracle. We've got to make some decisions as individuals about what we want to believe. We're not going to be able to prove these things one way or another.
After the Israelites had crossed to safety, the Bible tells us that once again God interceded. He commanded Moses to stretch his hand over the waters.
And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. Exodus 14:28.
The way to the Promised Land now lay open. When we return, the search for clues to the possible route taken by Moses and his band of wayward slaves as they venture into the wilderness and challenge the unknown.
More mysteries of the Bible when we return.
We now return to Mysteries of the Bible. The Sinai, one of the most inhospitable regions on earth. A 260-mile-long triangle of sand and searing heat, of towering granite mountains, of parched, waterless plains and dunes spread over an unyielding limestone plateau. A formidable place. It was through this wilderness that Moses and the people of Israel traveled to reach Canaan, the promised land. But the sands of time have obliterated their tracks. There remains not a single trace of their passing. Not a footprint, not a shard of pottery, not a scrap of evidence, where once, almost 3,500 years ago, the greatest migration in human history took place. Because of a complete lack of evidence, some have even asked, did the Exodus happen at all?
There have been, for a very long time, explorations and excavations throughout the Sinai Peninsula looking for traces of the Exodus. As far as I know, up until now, to this very day, none of that flurry of archaeological and exploratory activity has produced anything that is valid or that can help in this case.
Any large group of hundreds of thousands, if that number is even possible in the Sinai, would have left garbage, broken pottery, and so forth. Archaeology can tell us nothing about a large community existing there, and for that reason, most folks think there never was a large community which existed there.
It has become one of the most perplexing mysteries of the Bible. Perhaps the lack of clues is due to one enduring factor: the sheer immensity and emptiness of the Sinai.
I don't think the mystery of Sinai and the Sinai stories in the Bible will ever be satisfactorily resolved. People in the desert leave very few traces for archaeologists to follow. We need to remember that these are stories. They were stories written by later Israelites to try to explain the reality that they knew of their deliverance from bondage and of their inheritance of the land of promise. I don't think we'll ever be able to confirm them historically or archaeologically, however.
But which way did the Israelites head toward the Promised Land? The direct route, the shortest one, would have been the most dangerous. Following their earlier military campaigns into Canaan and other northern territories, there was a line of fortified Egyptian garrisons strung out all along the way. The next best course, across the central plateau, would have been the most difficult. Towering mountains and lack of water would have made it almost impassable. There was only one likely option: a long detour via the south.
For they were departed from Rephidim, and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mount. Exodus 19:2.
3 months into their trek, the caravan arrive at one of the most important places mentioned anywhere in the Bible: Mount Sinai.
We really don't know where that place is. There are many possibilities, a lot of speculation, but there's no way really to know where it was.
One of the most likely candidates is Jebel Musa, Arabic for Mountain of Moses. Looming over the desert, the mountain is a striking contrast to its surroundings. A church on its summit marks the spot where Moses is believed to have received the 10 Commandments.
Jebel Musa itself is a foreboding mountain. It's not a sand dune, but it's a rocky, craggy mountain. And it's in a very difficult section of the Sinai Peninsula. And you can feel like you're almost alone there. In fact, if you look around, you probably are alone. During the Byzantine era, that is to say, when Christianity had become the official religion of the empire, a number of pilgrims began to ask, where's Mount Sinai? where's Mount Nebo, and so forth. And Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses in Arabic, is the place that they were shown.
Nestling at the foot of the mountain is the monastery of St. Catherine's. Constructed on the site of a church originally built by the Roman Emperor Constantine nearly 1,600 years ago, the monastery stands in isolated defiance of the desert's eternal heat and dust. Craftsmen were specially brought here from Europe to spend 20 years sculpting its ornate basilica, chapel, and library. In its heyday, more than 400 Greek Orthodox monks lived and worshipped here. The monastery owes its existence to a wild desert plant that grows in its ancient courtyard. According to the local monks, it is the living remnant of the original burning bush mentioned in the Bible.
There is no archaeological proof of the authenticity of that site. It's a Byzantine site, centuries later than the events that are supposed to have happened there. And in fact, the real problem archaeologists have is in connecting the biblical stories of the itinerary of the Israelites through the wilderness with any places that we actually know and have excavated.
Of all the sights to be seen at Jebel Musa, perhaps none is more mysterious, nor more compelling that this might well be Mount Sinai, than the strange, completely natural rock formation at the foot of the mountain. It is a haunting image, evocative of a young bull. Especially mystifying when we recall that while Moses was away on the mountain for 40 days receiving the 10 Commandments, Aaron and the Israelites constructed their infamous idol, the golden calf, down below. So perhaps this was the spot. We may never know. When we return, a look at events which change the course of history as Moses and the people of Israel confront their God and make their holy covenant with him on a mountain called Sinai. More mysteries of the Bible when we return.
We now return to Mysteries of the Bible.
Somewhere in the barren desert of the Sinai, the God of Israel summons Moses to the top of a mountain and prepares to set his covenant with the people.
Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me, above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Exodus 19:5.
If they will accept his commandments, a binding agreement will exist between God and Israel. They will become his chosen people, entrusted with the task of preserving his laws and of making them known to the rest of the world. And so, on the 3rd day of the 3rd month, to the sound of heavenly trumpeting and a cataclysm of fire, smoke, and earthquake, the covenant is sealed. The 10 Commandments, divinely written by the finger of God, are given to Moses. 10 simple laws containing some of the most profound and revolutionary ideas in human history. They speak of mercy, of justice and temperance, and proclaim monotheism, the existence of only one God, forever severing the Hebrews from the pagan religions that were practiced up to that time. But were they unique? Were they the first of a kind?
There are a number of ancient law codes, the most famous of which is called the Code of Hammurabi, which predate the biblical law code and which have similar laws. What they don't have is that theoretical idea that ties all the commandments together, the idea that every human being is divine, irreplaceable, invaluable, and therefore how you treat every individual matters. In Hammurabi's code, for example, there are different penalties for killing somebody who's rich and killing somebody who's poor. In the Bible, a human life is a human life because every human face is stamped with the image of God.
But the 10 Commandments do seem to give us an overview of some of the main concerns of Hebrew law. There are the concerns for family sanctity, for example, of preserving the family structure. Economically, the family was an extremely important building block of ancient Israelite society. Your economic well-being depended on the integrity of the family, of passing down from generation to generation the economic life of your family and therefore of your tribe.
And what the Ten Commandments say is that therefore, how human beings treat one another is of interest to God. And that's what's different from the Ten Commandments and all previous laws. That is, God doesn't just care how we act towards God. God isn't just a God who pays attention to sacrifices and prayer. God cares if I lie to you, to another human being, and that's what makes it unique.
Many scholars have long puzzled over the commandment that strictly forbids the making of graven images.
That's a very interesting mystery about the God of the Bible. Why are they never allowed to portray this God in any way? No pictures, no statues, no images. It's a very interesting element of the religion of the Bible, and it serves to clearly differentiate them from the surrounding religions, particularly of the Canaanites. The famous Canaanite god Baal, after all, was frequently portrayed in a statue form. We have some of the statues of Baal that have been discovered by archaeologists.
Baal was often depicted in the form of a bull, a symbol used by pagan worshippers throughout the Middle and Near East since ancient times. It would soon play a featured role in the drama at Mount Sinai.
And the Lord said unto Moses, Go, get thee down, for thy people which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Exodus 31:7.
Most people believe that the golden calf was a substitute for God, but it wasn't. The golden calf was a substitute for Moses. Remember that the Israelites had just come from Egypt, where everything was visible. Egypt was a society that was very dedicated to seeing things. Pyramids, sphinxes, even mummified, even the realm of the dead was made visible. And what is God's message to the Israelites? That the visible is not the realist part of the world. The realist part of the world is the invisible, the intangible. God is the most real thing, and God is that which you can't see. Now, to this people who is used to seeing things, that's a very hard message. But as long as they had Moses there, they could see Moses was the one who speaks to God. So even though we can't see God, at least we can see Moses. Suddenly, Moses disappears up the mountain. Now, the Israelites aren't stupid. They know that the golden calf didn't take them out of Egypt, right? They know that. After all, the golden calf didn't exist 5 minutes ago. But they need a visible symbol of God. They can't get along without that symbol. They're too trained to see things. So they build a symbol of God in the absence of Moses, because they haven't learned yet that the key to worshiping God is to see the reality of the mysterious, of the intangible, of the invisible.
The cult of animal worship and the story of the golden calf has led some archaeologists to believe that another site may be the true location of Mount Sinai. Just 45 miles to the northwest of Jebel Musa lies an area rich in copper and turquoise. Known as Serabit el Khadem, this was once a flourishing mining center. First occupied 4,000 years ago, the place once echoed to the sounds of hundreds of laborers who toiled in Pharaoh's service. Mining operations reached their peak during the time of the Exodus. A temple carved from local rock is dedicated to Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of the earth and of minerals. Here, Hathor is mysteriously depicted as a deity with the ears of a cow. Elsewhere, she is seen in the complete form of the animal. Some scholars believe that Hathor is the Egyptian equivalent of the god Baal. The most fascinating archaeological evidence for this can be seen inside a nearby cave. scrawled on a wall more than 3,000 years ago, is one of the most ancient scripts in the world, a form of writing bridging the hieroglyphics of the Egyptians and the later alphabet of Canaan. Scholars debate whether these crude symbols are the forerunner of all the alphabets that developed in the Near East, but one thing they do agree on: the explicit appearance of the words Tubal. Could this have been the biblical Mount Sinai, where the Israelites received the Ten Commandments?
Sarabit el-Khadam in the western Sinai is a site that's often mentioned in this discussion. We do have evidence of Egyptian mines there and of Canaanite slaves there who left graffiti on the walls of the mines. These could be understood as the ancestors of the later Israelites, but that says nothing about the location of Mount Sinai.
And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle, and the pattern of all the instruments thereof. Even so shall ye make it. Exodus 25:8.
Having received the Ten Commandments, the people are now instructed by God to build an ark to contain the holy tablets. The ark itself would be housed in a tabernacle in the center of the encampment. All 12 of the tribes of Israel would pitch their tents around it.
In the middle you have the ark, which symbolizes God's presence. Around it you have arranged the priests and Levites, and then finally the entire people of Israel. So the notion of the thing symbolically is that the people of Israel live in a kind of permanent connection with the holiness of God. But the fact is, from everything we know about ancient religion, and from the description of the tabernacle as a tent shrine, and from the use of the word tent to describe the temple later on, it seems that the earliest Jewish temple must really have been built during the period of the desert wandering. So somehow or another, they must have taken whatever they had, put together the most beautiful house for God in the desert that they were capable of putting together.
Eventually, the ark would reach the Promised Land and become the focal point of Solomon's great temple in Jerusalem. It would remain there for the next 800 years. But here in the desert, the fate of the Hebrew slaves had been sealed. For having made and worshipped a golden calf, none of those present at Mount Sinai will ever live to see the land that flows with milk and honey. For another 4 decades, they will be condemned to wander through the wilderness. When we return, the mysterious final days of Moses as the Israelites reach the threshold of the Promised Land. More mysteries of the Bible when we return. Mysteries of the Bible continues. For 40 years, Moses and the Israelites have wandered through the wilderness. It has been a trek unparalleled in human history. What was once a throng of slaves has now been galvanized into a tightly wrought nation of 12 tribes. Unexplained mysteries have highlighted the years in the wilderness. God has guided the pilgrims through a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But it has been a difficult passage. Time and again, Moses has quelled rebellion within the ranks of the people, who have been impatient and demanding.
Wherefore have ye made us to come up out of Egypt, to bring us to this evil place? It is no place of seed, or of figs, or of vines, or of pomegranates. Neither is there any water to drink. Numbers 25. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water. And thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock, so thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink. Numbers 27.
Ironically, it is this deed that has condemned Moses. In a fleeting moment of anger, he strikes the rock in defiance of God, and so has been deemed unworthy of entering the land of Canaan. For the sin of the golden calf, those who originally left Egypt with him have also been condemned to the same fate. But as the older people have died out, a new generation waits to cross the threshold into the promised land.
And the Lord said unto Moses, Get thee up into this Mount Abarim, and see the land which I have given unto the children of Israel. And when thou hast seen it, thou also shalt be gathered unto thy people, as Aaron thy brother was gathered. Numbers 27:12.
What's really going on here? Why can't he enter into the promised land? One thing is certain, if you look at the biblical account, that it's clear that we're dealing to some extent with a generation gap. One generation disappears. That generation which experienced Egypt and everything that Egypt symbolized wasn't able to go into this new land. And what it is, Egypt symbolized to the Bible, it symbolized idolatry and immorality. The Bible says, well, wait a minute, right? Those who were there in Egypt don't go into the promised land. And Moses apparently gets sort of bitten by this same fate, if we want to put it that way.
It's very, very difficult for anyone of my generation, I think, to read that story and not think of that tremendously moving speech by Dr. Martin Luther King, who, like a modern Moses, was, in a sense, the leader of a great movement that taught so many of us so many important truths about God and God's people. And there's a sense in which his assassination demands an explanation. It demands for us that we face God and said, how could you have taken this Moses from us before he was finished? And that speech that Martin Luther King gave seemed to almost be an assurance to all of us that he knew that the promised land was coming. And he said in that speech, I may not get there with you, but I'm convinced that we as a people will get there. And so, oddly enough, I understand Moses much better by listening to Dr. King, because I think, like Moses, Dr. King had an insight into God's plan for the future as well.
So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre until this day. Deuteronomy 34:5.
God was involved in the burial of Moses. That doesn't say that about anybody else in the Bible in that way. So that marks Moses as having extraordinary powers, that God was kind of connected with him in a way that God isn't connected or wasn't connected with anyone else.
When the Torah ends, and when the last verses of Deuteronomy are read, they're not in the Promised Land. They're still in the desert. And the Bible is, in some sense, a book without an ending. Why is that? I think that part of the message of the Bible is life is lived in the wilderness. There is no perfect promised land in this world the way we think. There's trial and difficulty and pain. You don't need a Bible in the promised land, after all. If everything were perfect, you don't need a guide. But the Bible is a map to the wilderness. It's not a guide to the promised land. And so one of the central mysteries of the Bible is, how do we negotiate the wilderness, which is where we all live?
The perennial value of the Exodus story is that God is against injustice and has called the people into fellowship and has given them a homeland and so forth. And those are things which transcend any one particular generation. And it's one of the reasons why the stories are always told and retold, generation through generation.
So the final resting place of one of the greatest figures in all of human history remains unknown. The ultimate mystery in the extraordinary life of the man we know as Moses.
I think the message of Mount Nebo is, instead of visiting Moses' grave, follow what he taught. That's what really matters. And we have a tendency to worship the mountain and ignore the teaching. And so in some ways, I think what the Bible is telling us is the significance of Mount Nebo is it's insignificant. What really matters are the teachings of the person who's buried somewhere in its caverns.
And so, after 40 years of wandering, and guided by a new leader, Joshua, the people of Israel finally enter Canaan, the promised land, there to confront their destiny and to encounter more of the many mysteries of the Bible.
This is the Biography Channel.
You want to be yourself, but you're not allowed to be yourself.
This is the Biography Channel.
I was just beside myself with anger and disappointment.
This is the Biography Channel.
I'm the only actress he knows you have to pay to keep your clothes on.
Reality meets personality, only on the Biography Channel.
Biography Channel. What a concept!